From the letters of the early day apostles, it is obvious that they knew the great falling away had begun even while they were building the church, as I said in earlier chapters of this. There were members of the church who were even at that point preaching false doctrines. Paul particularly constantly warned the members to beware of the deceivers. This problem was a living example of the parable of the wheat and the tares, where the evil the apostles knew about was so mixed in with the good they also knew about, that any effort to keep out the false teachers and the false members would also have destroyed some of the good members. As in the case where a husband might want to take over leadership or exercise power or authority in some branch of the church because of a lust for power that he had, while his family sincerely believed in the gospel, and if the man was cast out, he would not have let his wife and children be part of the church anymore. The apostles were very seriously concerned that they not lose anybody and that nobody lose out on salvation because of the unrighteousness influence of anybody else. Paul could see that some, perhaps even many of the people he had taught the gospel to were losing their faith because of the false teachers. Some people followed the false teachers. Some stopped being active members because of the false teachings that the deceivers constantly brought up when the apostles were traveling away from the churches where these people were and visiting other places. To the church members in Galatia, Paul wrote, I marvel that ye are so soon removed from him that called you into the grace of Christ, unto another gospel, which is not another, but there are some that trouble you, and would pervert the gospel of Christ. And then, to point out the sin of those who were trying to pervert the gospel of Christ, he said, But though we or an angel from heaven preach any other gospel unto you than that which we have preached unto you, let him be accursed. Now, this last verse here is horribly mangled by many people because the vast majority of people who use it as a criticism of some other church with which they disagree without realizing one critical thing. The gospel as it was presented by Jesus to the apostles and as the apostles presented it to the churches that they organized is vastly different than what is taught in most churches today. So most churches today are preaching a different gospel than what the Savior taught the apostles and what the apostles taught the saints in their day. And only if you have the gospel as it was taught by the Savior and as it was taught by the apostles, which is not what we have in the Old Testament and the New Testament. I want to emphasize that. Not what we have in the Old Testament and New Testament. Only if you know what was properly taught can you say to somebody else, don't preach anything else. Because the vast majority of people who quote this to somebody else don't have the gospel that was taught by the Savior. The churches in Galatia were caught up in a very heated controversy that many Jews brought into the churches whenever they joined. The belief that these Jews had that before you could become a Christian, you had to accept Jewish law, particularly circumcision. Paul made it very plain to the Galatians that the gospel of Jesus Christ was incredibly far superior to the law of Moses. It fulfilled it. It superseded it. It was better than. And that these Jews, these wannabe Christians, were wrong and were totally inconsistent, even as Jews, in arguing for just one item of the law of Moses and neglecting the hundreds of other Jewish laws. Just shortly after the Savior had left them, there had even been some difference of opinion among the apostles about the necessity of circumcision. The apostles, after all, had all been Jews prior to the coming of the ministry of Christ and had all been circumcised, but this difference that they had had after he had left had been settled by their united and humble and prayerful effort to find out what the Lord wanted. The Lord told them circumcision was not something Gentiles had to do. Neither were the Jewish dietary laws. Neither was the law of Moses anything that Christians needed to follow. That had all been replaced by the gospel of Jesus Christ. The laws of Moses were laws for Jews in former times. The gospel of Jesus Christ was the gospel, the good news for now, and would be until the end of time. The problem was that many Jews and others simply refused to accept the Lord's instructions on this and many other basic beliefs, and actively went about telling people that, well, I like the apostles and Paul's really nice and all the rest of this, but he really just doesn't have it right about this. This circumcision thing is just a core. It's a symbol between us and God, and we really need it. And they would argue that their ideas were right, and these uninspired men were thus seeking to pervert the gospel of Christ. And if you do the same thing in your church, you're trying to pervert the gospel of Christ. Regardless of what the principle is, unless the principle is the basic worship as Christ taught. Now, this is just one example. This circumcision challenge that they had was just one kind of a problem caused by people who had joined the church and yet wanted to change the simple requirements of the gospel by introducing some elements of Judaism. In 2 Thessalonians, Paul wrote, "For the mystery of iniquity doth already work. Only he who now letteth will let, until he be taken out of the way. And then shall that wicked be revealed, whom the Lord shall consume with the spirit of his mouth, and shall destroy with the brightness of his coming." Now, most people haven't got a clue what that meant, but in the English of the 1600s, when the King James Version was made, the word let meant to restrain or to hold back. And when you put that meaning into there, what this verse means is that the evil spirit of sin and fighting against the gospel was already working in the church, but was being restrained or held back for a time. But that later, possibly with the death of the apostles, whatever it was that was holding it back, the sin back, even this restraint would no longer stop the spirit of sin and corruption, and the evil one would be in power. The phrase mystery of iniquity that Paul uses is very important. Many of the early perverters of the Christian faith were people who were members, but also attacked the gospel of Christ and the simple ways of worshiping because it was plain, because it was direct, because it was honest, and it was open to everybody. This total integrity and honesty was so vastly different from the deep mysteries of some of the cult divisions of Judaism and the corrupt pagan rites of idol worship that many of the Jews and many of the pagans were disappointed to find themselves involved in simple, open, honest worship, sitting beside and worshiping with women or children or common laborers or even, gasp, slaves. And the earliest changes in the form of worship were those where certain mystic ceremonies and supposed mysteries were introduced, as in the mystery of the sacrament, transubstantiation, where the bread is supposed to become the actual flesh of Christ and the wine is actually supposed to become the blood of Christ. This kind of intellectual and moral corruption and blasphemy has no place in the worship organized by the apostles, has nothing to do with anything the apostles said, has nothing to do with anything the Savior said, but it suited corrupt and ignorant and unspiritual men just fine. It made them look smarter and more important than they were in real life. Control over the knowledge and understanding of God gave these men control over the lives of the people who looked to them as leaders, and control was what these men wanted. Paul was very dedicated to helping those people he had taught keep their faith, which is what all of his epistles are about. The epistles are full of warnings and pleadings against the growing influence of these false doctrines among the members, and his feelings of absolute total agony at the sins of the members as they went about spreading these lies as though they were rumors or the newly found out things, and as they would not find out from the apostles whether or not they were true.